Like so many of us, I'm still reeling from the upheaval that's going on in America right now, and of course from the torture, prolonged torture and murder of George Floyd that just luckily happened to be caught on camera, unlike so many other instances of police brutality. The harassment that black people experience by the police and by people who are not police, the sort of implicit bias that white people and often even non-white people can feel towards black people is one element, one aspect of racism in our society that needs to be identified and fought against. I can think from my own life. Yeah, I was working at a WeWork in Harlem a few years ago, which is like this communal office space, and there was a security guard there. And I came one day on a Sunday, and he was the security guard and I were friendly. We would make small talk, and he was harassing a black kid in the space by telling me within earshot of this other black kid that he doesn't belong here. He doesn't work here, and the security guard was wrong. This was maybe one of his early days at WeWork, so he hadn't been there often. But and then when this black kid went to go buy something from the honesty market, the security guard was saying within earshot of the black kid, he's stealing, and I'm still horrified by that experience. I was such a deer in the headlights. It was a moment of real moral failing. I mean, I had read so many books about race in America. I had read The New Jim Crow already, and I could tell you all about McClesky versus Kemp and institutional racism, but I was such a deer in the headlights, being really party to that gross harassment. And I can only imagine what that was like for that kid. I mean, and if there's any closure, that security guard was never seen in WeWork again after that. He was certainly fired for what he did that particular day with me and that other kid in the office. But what I'm trying to say is, that's one element, that's one aspect, which is dark and horrible. I hope to have more courage next time I'm in a situation like that to stand up and say, what you're doing is harassing this kid who didn't do anything. That's one element. And the murder of George Floyd, that was for everyone to see and read, is one element. And a lot of people, there's a lot of consensus that that's bad and that we need to do a better job in America when it comes to harassment and violence and murder, literal murder of black people who did nothing wrong. But there's more to the story than that. And I think it's important to have an expansive, broad understanding of racism and the history of racism and the history of race in America. And I think without that, our perspective is going to be limited. The story of race in America begins and is characterized by a grotesque exploitation. The enslavement of black people and the way in which America was built, was literally built. The cotton that made America rich on the world stage was harvested by slaves. And the original construction of so much of America was done by slaves. And then when the Civil War happened and there was this moment of emancipation, there was an understanding. There was an understanding in America, there was an understanding among black people, there was an understanding in government that freedom means nothing without some property, without something to grow with, to some investment of land or money or wealth to build with. Freedom means nothing without that in our society. And William Tecumseh Sherman made a promise to the black refugees that they would get 40 acres of confiscated southern land each to build a life. And Reconstruction, the project of Reconstruction included many provisions for giving black people something. And all these promises were broken. And the language with which the Johnson administration broke these promises is so resonant today and is so common today. And I'll link to it in the description of this video. It's this language of, we want you to do it by yourself. We don't believe in handouts. You need to earn your own way in the world. This idea that reparations, if ever there was a case for reparations ever in the history of the world, if ever it made sense, if the reparations means anything, what the exploitation of black slaves in America is the perfect case for reparations. The story of blacks in America is a story of plunder, of consistent plunder. The Freedmen's Bank was a bank set up by the US government in the aftermath of the Civil War during Reconstruction. And again, was supposed to be an institution that can give certain products of credit, products of capitalism, products of innovation and investment to the black community to start to build wealth, to have a reliable banking system. African Americans were led to believe that their money was going to be insured by the government. And of course, in a short period of time, tens of millions of dollars that were held in those banks was lost in risky investments. And those people saw nothing of their money. It evaporated. And historians have written compellingly and accurately that there is distrust in the African American community today towards banking institutions and towards banks. And part of that mistrust comes from that experience, that historical memory. In 1921, there was a district of Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and it was one of the wealthiest, it was the wealthiest black community in America at the time, an entrepreneurial, successful community of African Americans. And in 1921, there was a race riot where whites rampaged through the community and destroyed tens of millions of dollars of property. They left 10,000 black people homeless, killing hundreds, injuring thousands. And again, it's this story of destruction and plunder. And over time, it became more about exclusion, discrimination. Coming out of the Great Depression, the New Deal, one of the New Deal projects was the Federal Housing Administration, which gave loans and mortgages to people to build a middle class, which has been, for decades and decades, the envy of the world. It's the middle class that I grew up in, that I'm heir to, that white America, so much of white America is an heir to. And it was done in partnership with banks, and banks were able to assess risk, and the banks decided that black neighborhoods are too risky. No investment in black neighborhoods. And of course, there was this emergence of these practices, these desperate practices of redlining and blockbusting and steering to exclude blacks from white areas and to ghettoize America, to force blacks into rundown, poor areas where they were not able to build wealth, where they're not able to buy homes. And of course, that's the legacy that we see all around us today. It's the legacy of these inner cities that are full of poverty and have been explicitly and implicitly excluded from the American dream, from this promise of a robust middle class. It starts to get repetitive. In 1944, the GI Bill was literally almost the exact same story. So much, the government did so much. The government moves mountains to invest in its middle class. These veterans coming back from war, giving them loans, paying for their education, giving them mortgages for houses, giving them a year's worth of unemployment insurance, everything. And African Americans are excluded from that project. Completely excluded from that project. And that's 1944. It's so recent, okay? It's our grandparents. The story of race in America is the story of exploitation. It's a story of violence, racial violence, terror designed to keep black people down, black communities down. It's a story of plunder again and again. And more recently, it's a story of exclusion. And it's a story of a country using black people as the stepping stone, climbing this ladder to the heights of wealth, the heights of success on the world stage. Again, a middle class which is the envy of the world, and then pulling up the ladder and saying, but nothing for you. Nothing for you. No housing loans for you. No serious effort to desegregate America and America's schools. The Supreme Court case, Brown versus the Board of Education, notwithstanding. And it's done in the name of libertarianism. It's done in the name of the inviolable word of the free market. The banks say it's too risky for you guys to have a meaningful banking product, for you to have a mortgage, for you to have a meaningful, affordable insurance. It's too risky. It's this libertarian rhetoric that people need to make it on their own. And it's a blindness, a libertarian, conservative blindness towards all the ways that the government has moved mountains to invest and give so many handouts to American business and to the American middle class as long as they're not black. The home mortgage interest deduction, this huge handout to America's middle class, no one complains about, no one thinks about, but the second you want to do something similar, some sort of policy that would favor the most exploited population in America, that's socialism. People need to do it on their own. The free market can't be tinkered with. It's sick, it's vile, it's vile. And it gives insight into the way that in the moment, people can be so blind. There are many privileges that are conferred on me and other people, other white people in America because they're white. One of those privileges is this ability to hoard. It's this ability to say, pick yourself up by your bootstraps. So much was done to invest in me and invest in my community. And now we want to say, no more investment. That's socialism. No more reparations. That's reverse racism. It's exactly the same idea and rhetoric that was used by those who wanted to dismantle the program of Reconstruction in America. Part of the trouble with race in America, with this discussion, no one feels racist. No one thinks they're racist. And some racism is visible to most people. I think there was really a kind of sea change that makes me somewhat hopeful that the murder of George Floyd was so grotesque and so horrific that people woke up and they opened their eyes and they say, wow, that's vile. But so much of racism is invisible. And unfortunately for us as a country, unfortunately for the morality of this country, it takes effort to see it. It takes work. It requires reading, and reading nonfiction, which is something I don't do enough of. I don't enjoy as much as I enjoy reading other genres. I push off, the hard-to-watch documentaries, the hard-to-read books about important historical issues. But without that, it's so easy. It's so easy. It's so human. It's so human to just believe, I'm not racist. We're not a racist country. So much of racism is invisible, and there's this asymmetry. The argument that says, I'm not racist, you're not racist, show me the racist law and we'll fight it together, is so intuitive and so compelling. But the argument against that takes effort. It requires history. It requires a complex understanding of economics and the history of the middle class and the history of exclusion and the way that the ghettoization of America was married with the drug war and was designed to create generational despair. and the way that lives on today with mass incarceration, on the failure of the Freedman Savings Bank. Fredrick Douglass wrote as follows, quote, "The history of civilization shows that no people can well rise to a high degree of mental or even moral excellence without wealth. A people uniformly poor and compelled to struggle for barely a physical existence will be dependent and despised by their neighbors, and all finally despise themselves." End quote. Of course, Frederick Douglass was a freed slave, and he's so right. I don't remember the exact number, I'd have to look it up, but I think it's like the racial wealth gap in America, like whites on average have 12 times the amount of wealth as blacks. There's no justice. There's no way to overcome racism. There's no way to have a country that recognizes the dignity of all human beings until we make progress on that racial wealth gap. And racial justice, the stories of racial justice and economic justice are interlinked, intertwined. Thanks for watching.